In a medieval German courtroom, a woman confessed her husband was a woman. But the judges weren't just shocked by the lie. They were horrified by the truth of their sex life. She revealed her husband used a fake phallus made of leather and wood. This wasn't just fraud, the court called it sodomy, a sin against God himself. In the year 1477, in the imperial city of Speyer, when an autumn chill had already begun to settle into the bones of the dirty streets, two women were brought before the town council. The air in the great hall was stale with the smell of old wood and the unwashed bodies of the burghers who had gathered to watch the day's proceedings. The women were an immediate and jarring spectacle. One was tall and broad-shouldered, her hair shorn short like a boy's, and she wore the unambiguous attire of a man, a coarse woolen doublet and hose. Her jaw was set, her gaze defiant, meeting the curious and hostile stares of the assembly without flinching. Following in her wake was another woman, a stark and fragile contrast. She was slight of build, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed upon the floorboards as if seeking refuge in the very grain of the wood. She seemed to shrink into herself, a ghost of a woman tethered to the solid, masculine presence of her companion. Their arrival caused a ripple of murmurs to spread through the hall, a low, inquisitive hum that was quickly silenced by the sharp rap of the magistrate's gavel. This was clearly not a routine case, not a simple matter of debt or theft. They were not led in by a city guardsman, bound in ropes or chains. Instead, their accuser was a civilian, their own neighbor, a draper by trade whose shop adjoined their small rented house. The man's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, a battleground of fear, moral outrage, and a kind of righteous, self-important fury. He pushed the two women forward with a trembling hand, his breathing shallow and rapid. He seemed as much a victim of the proceedings as they were, a man tainted by the proximity of the sin he had come to expose. He began to speak, his voice at first a stuttering, hesitant trickle, then a torrent of disjointed accusations. He pointed a shaking finger at the taller woman, the one in men's clothes, his words tumbling over one another in their haste to be heard. He did not speak of a common quarrel or an unpaid debt, the usual grist for the city's legal mill. The words he used were stranger, more freighted with a sense of profound and unnatural violation. He spoke of a secret, a blasphemy, an abomination that he had accidentally uncovered within the walls of their home. He whispered of a union that was a mockery of God and a perversion of the natural order. He described a grotesque parody of marriage, a relationship for which the laws of both men and the church had no proper name. He spoke of a terrible deceit, but the true nature of the crime seemed to elude his own understanding, hovering just beyond the limits of his vocabulary. The counselors leaned forward in their high-backed chairs, their expressions shifting from bored indifference to a sharp, predatory interest. They could sense that this was no ordinary case. This was something new, something dark, something that had the potential to stain the soul of their devout and orderly city. Several years before this public denunciation, a stranger had arrived in Speyer. This newcomer presented as a young man, lean and wiry, with a quiet and reserved demeanor that set them apart from the boisterous apprentices and journeymen of the city. No one knew their origins, a fact that was not entirely unusual in the transient world of a bustling imperial city. They offered a simple name, took up humble lodgings, and sought out honest work, quickly earning a reputation for diligence and sobriety. This individual, who would later be known to the court as Katrina Hetzeldorfer, was at that time known only by a male name, a convincing and well-maintained disguise that allowed them to navigate the rigidly gendered world of the late 15th century. Life in Speyer was governed by a strict and unforgiving set of social codes, where a person's role, their opportunities, and their very identity were dictated by their gender. To exist as a woman alone, without the protection of a father, a husband, or a convent, was to live a life of profound vulnerability and economic hardship. By adopting the guise of a man, Katrina was not merely engaging in a simple act of cross-dressing, she was performing a radical act of social and economic self-preservation, seizing for herself the freedoms and securities that were exclusively the domain of men. It was a dangerous, high-stakes performance, but for a time, it was a successful one. In the course of their new life, this young man soon encountered a young woman, a recent widow named Elizabeth. Elizabeth's life was a mirror image of Katrina's own precariousness. With her husband dead, she was left in a state of social and financial limbo, a dependent with an uncertain future. The courtship that ensued between them was, by all outward appearances, entirely conventional. It was modest, discreet, and swift, as was often the case in a world where marriage was as much a practical arrangement as a romantic one. They were two people on the margins of society, seeking the stability and companionship that a formal union could provide. Their decision to marry was a logical, if audacious, next step. They sought the blessing of the local parish priest, a man who, like everyone else, saw nothing to question in the proposed union. He saw a responsible young man seeking to provide a home for a respectable widow, a commendable act of Christian charity and social responsibility. The banns were read, the vows were exchanged, and the marriage was recorded in the parish register. With the full sanction of the church and the tacit acceptance of their community, Katrina and Elizabeth became husband and wife, their secret sealed behind a facade of unimpeachable legitimacy. They established a household that was, in its daily rhythms and outward appearance, indistinguishable from any other in their neighborhood. Katrina, in the role of the husband, would leave each morning for work, earning a modest living to support their shared home. Elizabeth, as the wife, would manage the domestic sphere, tending the hearth, preparing the meals, and maintaining the quiet, orderly life expected of a respectable townswoman. Their life was a meticulous and carefully constructed performance of normalcy, a shared conspiracy of two against a world that would never understand the true nature of their bond. To their neighbors in the cramped and crowded laneways of Spire, they were a perfectly ordinary, if somewhat reserved, couple. They were seen as quiet, hard-working, and pious, a self-contained unit that kept to themselves and caused no trouble. In the casual, everyday interactions of urban life, a shared greeting at the communal well, a brief exchange in the marketplace, a nod of acknowledgement at Sunday Mass, there was nothing to suggest the profound secret that lay at the heart of their household. They had successfully built a small, fragile sanctuary for their unconventional lives, a hidden world concealed in plain sight. But the maintenance of this shared reality required a constant, exhausting vigilance. Every public gesture, every spoken word, was part of the performance. Katrina had to navigate the exclusively male spaces of the workshop and the tavern, her every move scrutinized, her voice pitched just so, her lack of a beard or an Adam's apple a constant, low-level risk of exposure. Elizabeth, for her part, had to play the role of the dutiful wife, deflecting the casual, intrusive questions of the other neighborhood women about her husband and their marital life. Their existence was a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery and ruin. For a few years, their audacious gamble paid off. They found in their shared deception a form of freedom and a depth of companionship that would have been impossible for them to achieve otherwise. They had created their own world, with its own rules, a private reality that stood in direct opposition to the rigid, unforgiving order of the world outside their door. But their sanctuary was built on a foundation of lies, a fragile artifice that could be shattered by a single moment of carelessness, a single act of betrayal, or the simple, corrosive power of human jealousy. The peace they had so carefully constructed was, they would soon discover, a temporary and conditional one. The meticulously constructed world that Katrina and Elizabeth had built for themselves, their small fortress of domestic secrecy, was not brought down by the external pressures of a suspicious society, but by a catastrophic failure from within. The catalyst for their ruin was not a prying neighbor or a vigilant priest, but a common and corrosively human emotion, jealousy. Katrina, having successfully inhabited the role of a man in the public sphere, began to adopt the social behaviors that came with it. Living the life of a husband, she eventually succumbed to the temptation of infidelity, embarking on a clandestine affair with another woman. For Elizabeth, this betrayal was a cataclysmic event. It was not simply the pain of a faithless partner, it was a fundamental violation of the fragile and dangerous pact they had made. She had risked everything to build this life with Katrina, her safety and her very soul wagered on the integrity of their shared secret. Katrina's affair was a reckless act that threatened to unravel the entire delicate tapestry of their existence. In a single, desperate moment of rage and heartbreak, fueled by a sense of profound and utter betrayal, Elizabeth did the unthinkable, she broke the silence. She exposed their secret. Her revelation was not a calm, calculated confession, but an explosion of grief and anger. She confided in a neighbor, her words a torrent of accusation and despair, a desperate attempt to wound the person who had wounded her so deeply. She revealed the central, unbelievable truth of her marriage, that her husband, the quiet, hard-working young man known to the community, was, in fact, a woman. She had thrown a lit torch into the heart of their own home, an act of self-immolation born of a pain too great to bear in silence any longer. At first, the news was met with disbelief, dismissed as the hysterical ravings of a wronged and jealous wife. In a world where such a deception was almost literally unimaginable, the story seemed too fantastic, too monstrous, to be true. It was easier to believe that Elizabeth had gone mad with jealousy, that she was inventing a malicious and insane lie to slander the husband who had spurned her. The initial reaction was one of scornful pity for the poor, delusional woman, a response that for a brief moment seemed as if it might contain the fire before it could spread. But the seed of the idea, once planted, began to germinate in the fertile soil of the neighborhood's collective consciousness. The fantastic story, initially dismissed, quickly began to be whispered from doorway to doorway, from market stall to tavern corner. And as the story circulated, it began to accrete the weight of circumstantial evidence, the small, previously insignificant details of the couple's lives that now, in this new and lurid light, seemed deeply suspicious. The human mind, once given a narrative, is endlessly adept at finding evidence to support it. The neighbors, their curiosity piqued and their imaginations fired, began to retrospectively re-examine everything they thought they knew about the strange couple. They started to recall the oddities, the small inconsistencies that had previously been overlooked. One woman might recall that she had never once heard Katrina's voice break or deepen, that it always retained a strangely high, feminine pitch. A man might remember that Katrina had always demurred from joining the other men of the neighborhood in the public bathhouse, a central institution of male social life, always offering a plausible but now suspicious excuse. The draper who lived next door remembered hearing their arguments through the thin walls of their adjoining houses, and now realized that he had only ever heard two female voices, never the deeper tones of a man. Every remembered detail, no matter how trivial, was now reinterpreted through the lens of this monstrous new possibility. The couple's quiet, reserved nature, once seen as a sign of modesty, was now recast as a furtive, guilty secretiveness. The pieces of the puzzle, which had previously formed a picture of a normal, unremarkable marriage, were now being reassembled into a new and terrifying image. A creeping, insidious vine of suspicion began to grow, its tendrils wrapping themselves around the couple's small house, isolating them in a bubble of unspoken accusation. The atmosphere in their narrow lane changed. The casual greetings from neighbors became less frequent, replaced by cold, assessing stares. A wall of silence began to rise around them, the silence of a community that has identified a foreign body in its midst and is preparing to expel it. The whispers had done their work, transforming the couple from quiet neighbors into monstrous and fascinating freaks. The final, fatal blow came from the draper, the very neighbor who had first heard Elizabeth's heartbroken confession. One evening, an argument between the two women escalated, their voices rising in anger and despair, their words now carrying clearly through the wall. The draper, his ear pressed against the cold plaster, listened intently. And in the midst of their recriminations, he heard the unambiguous, damning words that confirmed the entire, unbelievable story. He heard Elizabeth accuse Katrina not just of infidelity, but of her fundamental deception, her usurpation of a man's role. He now had the proof, not from a hysterical wife, but from the mouth of the accused herself. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, the draper felt the weight of his Christian duty settle upon him. This was no longer a matter of neighborhood gossip, it was a matter of public morality, of a profound sin being committed in his very midst. To remain silent was to be complicit in this abomination. The next morning, his face a mask of grim and righteous certainty, he made his way to the town hall. He sought out the city magistrates and, in a low, trembling voice, he laid out his accusation, an act that would not only seal the fate of the two women, but would also earn him a place in the history of one of the most unusual trials of the medieval era. The interrogation began on familiar legal ground, the magistrates proceeding with the cautious, methodical approach of men accustomed to the mundane realities of urban crime. The initial charges laid against Katrina were straightforward and comprehensible within their existing legal framework: fraud, public deception, and the violation of sumptuary laws that strictly governed the clothing appropriate to one's gender and social station. To wear the clothes of the opposite sex was, in itself, a serious public order offense, an act of social rebellion that subverted the divinely ordained hierarchy of the world. The initial focus of the court was on the public, visible crime of Katrina's masculine disguise. But as the questioning proceeded, the all-male panel of judges found themselves navigating increasingly strange and uncharted territory. While the crime of a woman dressing as a man was not entirely unheard of, the purpose behind Katrina's deception seemed to go far beyond the usual motivations of disguise for travel or escape. The fact that she had not just adopted male attire, but had fully inhabited a male identity to the point of contracting a legal, church-sanctioned marriage, was a conceptual leap that the judges struggled to comprehend. They could sense that they were confronting something far more profound and disturbing than a simple case of fraudulent misrepresentation. Their questions, initially focused on the practicalities of the deception, began to probe deeper into the nature of the relationship between the two women. They could not grasp the internal logic of this bizarre union. What was the purpose of this elaborate, blasphemous parody of a true marriage? Was it a scheme to defraud Elizabeth of some inheritance? Was it a form of witchcraft, a demonic inversion of a holy sacrament? The very nature of the crime was a puzzle, a monstrous anomaly that defied all their legal and theological categories. A palpable sense of unease began to settle over the courtroom, the feeling of men peering into a dark and previously unimagined abyss of human behavior. Faced with the court's relentless, probing questions, and crushed by the weight of her own guilt and public shame, Elizabeth's fragile composure finally shattered. The magistrates, sensing a weakness, focused their pressure on her, the seemingly more vulnerable of the two women. Under the intense, unblinking stares of the assembly, broken by fear and abandoned by the person for whom she had risked everything, she began to confess. Her testimony, delivered in a low, choked whisper, was a torrent of shame and self-recrimination, the final, agonizing act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. She told them everything. She recounted the story of Katrina's arrival in Spire, the adoption of a male identity, and the carefully constructed life they had built together. She confirmed that they had sought and received the blessing of the church for their marriage, a confession that caused a shocked murmur to ripple through the courtroom, as it implicated the local clergy in this monstrous deception. She described their domestic life, the roles they had played, the lies they had told, painting a detailed and damning portrait of their shared conspiracy against the laws of God and man. But the magistrates were not satisfied. They pushed her further, their questions now turning to the most private and, for them, the most incomprehensible aspect of the affair, the nature of their intimate, physical relationship. How, they demanded to know, could two women, two creatures who were by nature passive and receptive, replicate the central, defining act of a true marriage? How did Katrina, a woman, perform the duties of a husband? This was the central, unthinkable mystery, the final locked door that they were determined to break down. And then, her voice barely audible, her face buried in her hands as if to shield herself from the horror of her own words, Elizabeth described their sexual life. She spoke of an object, an instrument that Katrina had fashioned and used to simulate the act of male penetration, to play the part of a man in their marriage bed. She described an implement, skillfully crafted from wood and covered in soft, dyed red leather, shaped into the unmistakable form of a male member. She explained how this object had been used to fulfill her wifely needs, a phrase that hung in the air like a death sentence. A profound and absolute silence fell upon the courtroom. The lewd, curious whispers of the spectators died in their throats. Even the hardened, cynical magistrates seemed momentarily stunned, their faces a mixture of shock, revulsion, and a kind of horrified fascination. The confession of this single, concrete object, this instrument, had in an instant transformed the entire nature of the case. It provided the final, missing piece of the puzzle, the physical evidence that elevated the crime from a strange and unprecedented act of social fraud into something far more ancient and terrifying. The crime now had a name that struck fear into the heart of every man in the room. This was not just a parody of marriage, it was an act of sodomy. The term, usually reserved for the unnatural acts of men with other men, or of humans with animals, was now being applied to these two women. Katrina had not merely usurped the social role of a man, she had, through the use of her diabolical instrument, usurped his fundamental, God-given sexual function. She had not just broken the laws of the city, she had committed a monstrous sin against nature, a crime so vile that it was believed to threaten the very fabric of creation. The trial was no longer about public order, it was about the damnation of souls. With Elizabeth's devastating confession hanging in the stunned silence of the courtroom, the trial moved swiftly towards its inevitable conclusion. The proceedings, which had begun as a confused and unprecedented inquiry, now accelerated with the grim, terrifying certainty of a heresy trial. There was no need for further witnesses, no lengthy legal arguments. Elizabeth's testimony, coerced though it may have been, was treated as an irrefutable and comprehensive admission of guilt, a confession that damned not only herself but, more completely, her partner. Katrina, who had remained defiant and silent throughout much of the proceedings, now found herself condemned by the words of the woman she had once called her wife. The intimate secrets of their shared life had been transformed into a public indictment, their private world laid bare and dissected on the cold slab of public justice. For the magistrates, the case was now terrifyingly clear. The final, lurid detail of the artificial phallus had provided them with the conceptual key they needed to understand the true magnitude of the crime. This was not merely a case of social transgression or public deception. In their eyes, it was an act of profound theological rebellion, a crime against God himself. Katrina's actions were now reinterpreted through the lens of heresy. She had not simply pretended to be a man, she had, in their view, committed the far graver sin of usurping the male role, a role that was not a social construct but a divinely ordained and immutable part of the natural order. To be a man was to hold a specific place in God's creation, a place of authority and activity that Katrina had audaciously and blasphemously claimed for herself. Her sin was one of profound inversion. She had created a grotesque and sacrilegious parody of the holy sacrament of marriage, one of the central pillars of their Christian society. She had taken an institution designed by God for the procreation of children and the sanctification of a specific kind of male-female bond, and she had twisted it into a sterile, unnatural union dedicated solely to the satisfaction of unnatural lusts. Her use of the instrument was the most horrifying aspect of this inversion. She had not only mimicked the male form, but had also mimicked the male function, a diabolical act of appropriation that struck at the very heart of their understanding of gender, sex, and the divine plan for humanity. This was a crime that threatened the very foundations of their world. In the medieval worldview, society was a divinely ordered hierarchy, a great chain of being where every person and everything had its proper, God-given place. Men were to rule, women were to obey. The active, penetrating role in sex was exclusively male, the passive, receptive role was exclusively female. Katrina's actions had thrown this entire, fragile order into chaos. She had proven that the boundaries between male and female could be blurred, that a woman could, through sheer force of will and artifice, assume the social and even the sexual prerogatives of a man. This was a possibility so terrifying, so profoundly destabilizing, that it had to be met with the most extreme and violent form of judicial response. The verdict, when it came, was therefore swift, unanimous, and utterly devoid of mercy. There was no room for legal nuance, no consideration of mitigating circumstances. The court, acting as both a secular and a spiritual authority, saw itself as a surgeon excising a cancerous tumor from the body of their Christian community. Katrina Hetzeldorfer was found guilty of the crime of sodomy, a charge that placed her in the same category as the most reviled and condemned of sinners. She was also, implicitly, found guilty of heresy, of a fundamental rebellion against the laws of God and nature. The sentence was the harshest available to the court, death. For Elizabeth, the court chose a different, though still severe, punishment. She was seen as the weaker, more passive partner in the crime, a misguided and foolish woman who had been led astray by the stronger, more transgressive will of her partner. While she was not entirely absolved of guilt, her participation in the unnatural acts and her complicity in the public deception made her a sinner in her own right. She was not seen as the primary architect of the abomination. Her confession, her public display of remorse, and her status as the woman in the relationship all served to mitigate her sentence. She was not to be executed, but her life within the city of Speyer was over. The court sentenced her to permanent exile, a social death that would cast her out from her home and community, forever branded as a participant in a monstrous and unspeakable crime. The judgment was a stark and brutal reaffirmation of the established order. It sent a clear and terrifying message to the community: the boundaries of gender were absolute and divinely enforced. Any attempt to cross them, to challenge the natural hierarchy of man over woman, would be met with the full and terrible force of the law. Katrina's crime was not just that she had loved another woman, it was that she had dared to do so in a way that mimicked and therefore challenged the male prerogative. She had created a world without men, a self-sufficient female union that rendered the male role redundant. And for this act of profound social and theological audacity, the all-male court, in a desperate and violent act of self-preservation, condemned her to be erased from the world. On a cold October day, under a sky the color of lead, Katrina Hetzeldorfer was led from the city dungeon for the last time. The air was sharp with the first real bite of winter, and the sparse crowd that had gathered to witness the final act of her tragedy huddled in their woolen cloaks, their faces grim and curious. She was still dressed in the male clothing that had been both her liberation and her condemnation, a final, defiant symbol of the identity she had carved out for herself. Her hands were bound behind her back, but she walked with a steady, unbowed gait, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to meet the eyes of the people who had come to watch her die. But her destination was not the marketplace square, where a pyre would typically be erected for heretics and witches. The court of Speyer, in its final judgment, had chosen a different method of execution for her, a punishment that was both symbolic and deeply gendered. Fire was the purifying element, the fate of those whose souls were believed to be tainted by demonic heresy, a fate most often reserved for men. For a woman convicted of the most heinous of crimes, a different, darker element was often employed: water. She was not to be burned, she was to be drowned, a sentence that carried its own unique weight of shame and finality. The procession moved through the narrow, winding streets of the city, a small, grim parade consisting of the condemned, a few city guards, a priest murmuring the last rites, and a trailing crowd of silent spectators. They left the cramped confines of the city walls and made their way down to the banks of the river Rhine. Here, the world opened up into a vast, desolate landscape of gray water and gray sky. The river was swollen with autumn rains, its current a powerful, swirling force, cold and indifferent. This was to be her grave, a vast, unmarked expanse of moving water that would offer no monument, northwest final resting place. The choice of drowning was a deliberate and symbolic one. It was a punishment that sought not just to extinguish life, but to utterly erase the identity of the condemned. To be burned was to be made a terrifying public spectacle, your death a fiery sermon against heresy. But to be drowned was to be simply disappeared. It was a death of oblivion, a sentence that consigned the body to the cold, dark depths, to be carried away by the current, its final fate unknown. It was a punishment that mirrored the nature of her crime in the eyes of the court. She had created an unnatural, hidden life, and now she would be given an unnatural, hidden death. The final moments were stark and devoid of ceremony. There were no last speeches, no public confessions. The priest offered a final, hurried prayer, his words snatched away by the cold wind blowing off the water. The guards pushed her forward to the edge of the rickety wooden dock, the turbulent river churning just below her feet. For a moment, she stood poised between the solid ground of the world that had condemned her and the liquid oblivion that awaited her. Then, with a rough, final shove, she was cast into the icy, churning water. There was a brief, violent struggle as the cold shock hit her, her body instinctively fighting against the inevitable. Her bound hands made any attempt to swim impossible. The heavy wool of her masculine clothes, once a symbol of her freedom, now became a leaden shroud, pulling her down into the depths. She surfaced once, her short-cropped hair dark against the gray water, her mouth open in a silent cry that was lost in the roar of the river. Then she was gone, pulled under by the relentless force of the current, her existence extinguished in a final, swirling vortex of dark water. Her body, still clad in the clothes of a man, was swept away, carried downstream by the powerful currents of the Rhine, never to be seen again. The crowd on the bank watched for a few moments, their faces impassive, and then began to disperse, returning to the warmth and order of their lives within the city walls. The spectacle was over. The anomaly had been purged. The natural order had been violently, and publicly, restored. In the official city chronicles of Speyer, the entire, complex tragedy was reduced to a few, cold, bureaucratic lines of ink on parchment. The record noted the charges, the trial, the verdict, and the execution, all recorded with the dispassionate precision of a bookkeeper balancing his accounts. Katrina Hetzeldorfer's name was entered into the ledger of the condemned, a final, anonymous entry in the long and brutal history of medieval justice. This brief, chillingly mundane record is one of the first, and one of the very few, explicitly documented cases of a woman being executed for homosexual acts in medieval Europe. Her story, a tale of audacious self-creation and tragic betrayal, was almost entirely washed away by the river that claimed her life. It survives only as a cold, factual entry in a court register, a historical footnote that speaks volumes about the world that produced it. It leaves behind only the stark, chilling question that echoes down through the centuries: how many other stories like hers were never written down at all? How many other lives were simply and silently erased by the currents of history?